Welcome everyone to today's webinar on options for your surrogacy journey abroad. My name is Bram from GoSurrogacy.com, and today I'm being joined by Bill Houghton of Sensible Surrogacy. Sensible Surrogacy is an IVF and surrogacy consultancy with client support in Europe and North America. Sensible Surrogacy advises on solutions for assisted reproduction, IVF and surrogacy, and also has negotiated programs for IVF and surrogacy in Ukraine, India, the United States, and most recently in Kenya. Bill has been through the process of surrogacy twice and has 2 boys born with the help of surrogate mothers in India. Since the birth of his second son, Bill has become a leading international advocate for ethical gestational surrogacy worldwide. Today, Bill will share with us the costs, benefits, and risks of international gestational surrogacy. Bill will give an overview of the local situation and legal framework in a variety of countries. So let me try and add Bill to the webinar.
Well, good morning, good afternoon.
Hi, that's all working. Great, excellent, good to see you. How are you today?
I'm good, it's good. It's a beautiful sunny day in Barcelona, and I'm glad to be here with everybody.
That's excellent, great. So Bill, you've prepared a presentation for us today. Shall we start with that?
Yeah, please. There's a lot of information, so I hope I don't go too long.
That should be fine. Let me just pull up the presentation. There you go.
Okay, now you're going to navigate, so I'll just tell you when I need to move to the next slide.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, no problem.
Okay, great. Well, tell me when you want me to begin.
Yeah, go ahead. Please start. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, like Bram said, Sensible Surrogacy is a consultancy that works with couples worldwide to basically give insights and help them in their surrogacy and IVF and assisted reproduction options worldwide. And we consult with clients basically for free who are considering the process. When I went through the process myself, there were few resources. So I vowed when I started this business that I would be helpful to other clients. And so when I get a call or an email from a couple or single, in some cases, who are thinking about surrogacy, really the first question that they always ask is, where is it legal? Where can I do this? And typically they've seen, news reports about India closing and Thailand passing laws and people being imprisoned in Cambodia. And so the natural question is, well, where is it legal? But there's actually a second question that few people ask, which is really even more important, which is not only where I can do it, but where I should do it. And that's one of the points that I wanted to talk about today. It's not only where surrogacy is possible, but where surrogacy is really desirable. So in terms of surrogacy destinations, we really consider this in three buckets. And the first are places worldwide where commercial surrogacy is legal. And commercial surrogacy is really what we think of when we think of a surrogacy contract and hiring a surrogate mother and an agent and going through the process. And the number of places worldwide where commercial surrogacy is legal and legislated is very limited. It's actually the United States is an obvious choice, but also Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Georgia, Russia, although we don't do a lot of work in Russia, they all allow for commercial surrogacy. The second group is what we would call altruistic surrogacy, and this is the next slide. And this would include places like Canada, the United Kingdom. Greece allows for altruistic surrogacy. And altruistic surrogacy, everybody who's done some research realizes, well, this is where the surrogate doesn't get paid, or she gets paid only her own private expenses. But actually, altruistic surrogacy is a lot more restrictive than that, because under altruistic surrogacy laws, professional services that support surrogacy are illegal. For example, you can't find an agent who's going to manage your program. It would be very difficult to find a service that would professionally match you or recruit surrogates for you. Lawyers, in many cases, can't directly advise you on surrogacy procedures that could be considered commercial. So when you're looking at altruistic surrogacy worldwide in some of these destinations, you realize that there's actually a lot of work that you have to do yourself because professional services are not available. Now, the third group, which is the next slide, which is we call unlegislated surrogacy destinations. Now, these are places that have been in the news recently, and they include things like Laos, Guatemala is an up-and-coming spot. Kenya is an up-and-coming spot. And basically, these are places where surrogacy is possible, but only because there is no law prohibiting it. And essentially, what this allows for is that any individual or couple can create a private contract with a woman to carry a baby for them, and then, under the terms of the contract, give the baby to them at the end of the process. And of course, the risk here is that, that may be a perfectly fine private contract, but it has no enforcement under the law. And if the woman were to break the terms of that contract, there's very little recourse that you could do because the law is really on her side. Also, in altruist or in unlegislated surrogacy destinations, there's always the risk that new legislation is going to be imposed, right? Where there is this void of legislation, and typically that means that the government, if they are alerted to some sort of public scandal or media attention, could step in and pass laws. And this is what we've seen in Southeast Asia, where the laws that were suddenly passed were very, very draconian, and people got arrested. Parents were threatened. Children were sort of trapped in some countries for a while, right? So next slide is, now that we have sort of these destinations that are available, how do you choose what's the correct spot for you? And our friends at Patients Beyond Borders, which is a medical tourism consultancy, have a list of sort of these 5 criteria that you look for when you're thinking about an overseas destination for medical tourism. And surrogacy really is a form of medical tourism, right? And the first thing is, they look for permissive legislation and a cultural attitude that supports your procedure. And the second, everybody should not be surprised, is the potential for cost savings. Political transparency, and this has been a big problem in some of Southeast Asia, where there really isn't political transparency in some of these sort of authoritarian governments. And a fourth one, which a lot of people don't typically think about, is a tourism infrastructure. When the baby is born, you're probably going to spend a month or more in that country with the newborn. Is there an infrastructure in the country to support a tourist for that long? Is it going to be easy to live there? Is it going to be comfortable? Or is corruption on the street going to be so vehement that you can't, go to the grocery store without being, hit up for cash? The fifth part is actually, in my mind, the most important, which is the existence of a strong healthcare infrastructure. And in our case, we're looking at neonatal infrastructure specifically. Patients Without Borders has a long list of sort of criteria to measure the existence of healthcare infrastructure, but it's kind of difficult to measure all of that in a country like Laos or a country like Kenya. So we at Sensible Surrogacy, what we've done is sort of put together our own index, and you can see it on the next slide, which is sort of a measure of quality of healthcare worldwide in these different countries. And essentially what we've done is we've looked at numbers from the WHO and UNICEF and the World Bank in order to come up with a sense of how risky is it to have a baby in any of these countries. We looked at specifically the number of deaths, neonatal deaths, either from the baby or from the mother, per the number of live births. And then we measured that and we compared that to income inequality, so that we had a sense of how diverse the healthcare system was. Was there sort of a very wealthy healthcare sort of economy that was running that could skew the results. And what we've seen is, in some cases, it's a little surprising. What we see now are sort of the top tier destinations among the most popular surrogacy sort of hubs. The first is the United Kingdom. This is an altruistic destination. The overall score is 8, and you want to be low in this case, right? Low means that you're pretty safe. Canada is 10. Ukraine is a surprising number 3. They come in at 12, actually ahead of the United States, and the reason is because they have a very low number of neonatal deaths, and their level of income inequality is quite low, much more so than the United States, and that's why Ukraine sort of sneaks in under the United States. Thailand and Georgia sort of round out, the top group with 24 and 33 respectively. Now, this is what we would consider to be a pretty, these are pretty safe destinations. The chances that your baby is going to have difficulty in any of these countries is relatively low. There seems to be a healthcare system in place that specifically supports, childbirth and pregnancy, and if there's an emergency, there are typically hospitals with neonatal intensive care units and fully equipped to handle those kind of emergencies. We go to the next slide, which is sort of the bottom 6, right? And in this case, we're looking at countries like Cambodia. Now, remember that the lower the number is, the better. And the overall score for a country like Cambodia is 56, and Guatemala, which is sort of an up-and-coming spot, 65, right? And the reason why those numbers are beginning to climb is because you look at the number of neonatal deaths per year, or the rate of neonatal deaths per year. In a country like Guatemala or Cambodia, nearly 2% of live pregnancies, or 2% of pregnancies result in some sort of death, right? In some sort of infant mortality, and we measure that by a death within the first 28 days of the child's life. India, surprisingly, comes in poorly at the bottom of this chart, and that's really, I think, an outlier because we have had great results in India, and India has specifically set up medical tourism facilities in their country. So the typical tourist who goes to India isn't really receiving the same kind of healthcare as the rest of the country is. Kenya, Laos, 127, 148. These are sort of the lowest end destinations where the level of neonatal care is very low. The risks to a pregnancy are quite low. And oddly, Kenya and Laos are up and coming surrogacy destinations now because the higher end places, like Thailand, are closing down. And as a result, couples are forced to go to sort of these frontier destinations like Cambodia or Guatemala or Kenya. And as a result, the risks go way, way up. So the next slide, what I want to do is
what's the situation?
Cyprus is kind of an outlier. It's difficult to know exactly what the situation in Cyprus is because the population is so small, right? So we ran these numbers, and the overall score for Cyprus turned out to be 5.3, which would put it at the very highest end of the scale. And really, it's simply because the population of Cyprus is so small that the number of neonatal deaths per year is only about 20. And with numbers that small, it's difficult to really draw a conclusion. But it seems as though Cyprus is a pretty healthy destination. We don't see in Cyprus the kind of failure of the medical system that we see, in Kenya or Guatemala or Cambodia. Cyprus seems to be a good destination, although it's kind of hard to quantify it.
Okay.
So sort of looking overall at the scale, what I want to do is check out some specific destinations and what is the legal framework and what's the availability here. The first is Ukraine, and Ukraine actually is a pretty good spot to have commercial surrogacy. It ranks very high in the level of neonatal care, but also the local legislation is very supportive. And this is true in several of the Eastern European countries. This is true, for instance, in Georgia. It's true in Russia, where commercial surrogacy is legal, but it's also very restricted because only heterosexual couples are permitted to continue. Couples have to demonstrate that they have a diagnosed infertility condition, and as a result, the downside or the negative of Ukraine is the same as its upside, because there's this strong legislation in support of surrogacy, and when the baby is born under Ukrainian law, the intended parents are absolutely the legal parents, and the birth certificate is issued in their name, and the clinics follow this to the letter. There's also very strict bureaucracy, and the amount of paperwork in a country like Ukraine, in a country like Georgia, is very, very extensive, because you have to prove that you meet all of these qualifications. And actually, the paperwork, I would say, is in a country like Ukraine is the most difficult part. Costs in Ukraine right now are coming in around $46,000 for the entire package, and the bulk of that goes to surrogate compensation, because surrogates in Ukraine actually make a pretty good living relative to the United States in terms of adjustments for cost of living. They actually make higher than surrogates in the United States do. The next country is sort of the gold standard, and that's the United States. And everybody knows that surrogacy is legal in the United States, and we actually rank the United States one step lower than Ukraine in terms of the legality, because the United States has laws that are supportive only on a state-by-state basis. So there is no federal legislation supporting surrogacy. But that's a really minor point, because typically, if you have if you're working with a reputable firm or reputable clinic, it's going to be in a state that is supportive. You wouldn't, for example, go to Alabama to have a surrogacy procedure done. You'd go to California, you'd go to Texas, you'd go to one of the supportive states, and the supportive states are pretty supportive. Texas, for example, allows for surrogacy, but only for heterosexual couples. California is open for all couples and singles. The prices in the United States range widely from about $74,000 for the entire package up to $150,000. And there's a couple of caveats to that cost. First off, is in the United States, under law, the entirety of the surrogate's compensation has to be paid upfront into an escrow account that's managed by an independent banker. So unlike surrogacy programs that you would find overseas, in the United States, there's a huge sort of initial investment that needs to be made, and also because healthcare is such a problem in the United States, and healthcare costs, health insurance is also required in the United States. Programs, the reason why programs in the United States, the costs vary so widely, is that their traditional programs are managed in a very, very different way than what we would see in a country like Ukraine or India or Thailand. A traditional program is, the parents would decide that they want to have a baby through surrogacy. They would contact an agent, and the agent would contact a clinic, and the clinic would contact a lawyer, and at that point, all the players in that party come together, and they start negotiating the contracts and putting together the deal. And there's a sort of round of organization to put together the program, and as they negotiate, the prices go up and up and up. The result is that you have programs that are very flexible, right? Because they're basically put together on an individual basis, but the costs are enormous. The surrogate is is basically in competition with the clinic and the parents in terms of her compensation, and her lawyer is negotiating as much as he possibly can for her. The IPs, the parents, they have a lawyer who's negotiating as much as they can, for the parents, and as a result, the programs become very expensive. The alternative to that are what we call negotiated programs. And this is a new concept that's emerging in the US. And essentially, what negotiated programs have come from are from countries like Mexico or countries like India that had strong surrogacy businesses going, but then were closed down. And the agents and the clinics that were working these countries brought their business model to the United States with an intention of trying to create a low-cost program in the United States that would compete effectively with programs in Eastern Europe. And a negotiated program is where the surrogate's agent and the clinic and the IP's agent and the lawyers all come together long before the parents come into the picture and negotiate a set package that is completely defined, all of the pieces are in place, and the prices are very tightly managed. And as a result, the prices are nearly half of what you would get in a traditional program. But the trade-off there is that there's very little flexibility in these programs. You sign up for a negotiated program, and you use the clinic that has negotiated the price. You use the surrogate comes from the agent who's negotiated as part of the package, right? So everything is sort of laid out for you, and the price is set, and the price is a good bargain if you don't need to be very flexible in how the program works. There's sort of a third bucket here, which is a flavor of negotiated programs, which are cross-border programs. So this is a negotiated program where the IVF clinic is actually a clinic from outside of the country where the baby is going, where the pregnancy is going to be and the baby is going to be born. And this in North America, this means Mexico. But there's cross-border programs in Southeast Asia. There are cross-border programs actually in India and Kenya. And basically, it's very like the negotiated programs, except we knock about $10,000 off of the price because you're saving money on clinical fees by using a Mexican clinic. Everybody asks me, the next slide is about Donald Trump. Everybody asks me when we talk about the United States, what's going to happen with Donald Trump? And my answer is not a lot. We don't expect a lot to happen because of the Donald Trump presidency. It really affects us, in two ways. The surrogacy programs are not likely to be affected, primarily because surrogacy in the U.S. is managed on a state-by-state basis, and Trump, as a devout conservative, likes state is a proponent of states' rights in the U.S., which means that he believes that states should legislate their own social programs. So it's very unlikely that Donald Trump and his administration would put forward a law at the federal level to legislate what is essentially, in his mind, a state's issue. So I don't expect that there's going to be any real changes in the legal framework regarding surrogacy. However, he does have a very strict opinion about how visa programs work. And this could make it difficult for parents or egg donors from some parts of the world to come into the United States for a surrogacy procedure. And we've already seen this, that it's getting a little bit more difficult for some egg donors from Mexico or some egg donors from Eastern Europe to come into the United States in order to donate. And that causes a problem. People always ask, are you going to be able to get health insurance now that the Obamacare thing is being repealed? And the answer is, yeah, there are private insurance programs that will cover surrogacy procedures. And you just have to sort of hunt around for those, but they're usually pretty good and pretty affordable. In terms of the cost in the US, the next slide, like I said, it ranges from about $140,000 now for a typical traditional program to about $74,000. The surrogate compensation is a huge part of that, but even more, if you look at the higher fee, right, the traditional fee, $16,000 for legal expenses, right? If you were to go to India or to Ukraine, legal expenses are probably about $2,000 or $3,000, right? That's the sort of the attitude in the U.S., right? It's everybody wants to sue everybody else, and so the lawyers have a great deal of work for them trying to protect everybody and get the most that they can. Leaving the U.S. now, we can go back to Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, everybody asks about, well, what's the law now in Thailand? What's going on in Cambodia? The situation in Southeast Asia, and I should say that I still actually have some clients in Southeast Asia, but in general, I'm pulling everybody out of the region, and primarily because the cultural attitude in Southeast Asia is very, very anti-surrogacy, and it's going to be that way forever. My personal view is that region has had a long troubled history dealing with human trafficking and sort of the appearance that the region has not been hard enough to crack down on human trafficking. And as a result, the local governments are seeing surrogacy as sort of a form of human trafficking, and they are being relentless in their pursuit to shut it down. So Thailand has passed laws that have basically restricted surrogacy out of existence. Cambodia has promised to create laws, but in the meantime, their Justice Department, their Justice Ministry is unilaterally just arresting people and trumping up charges in order to crack down on surrogacy procedures, which is sort of the second big risk in Southeast Asia, is that these countries, in many cases, they're not very Western leaning, and they don't follow the kind of Western protocols in terms of legality. They don't necessarily believe that they need to pass laws and legislation before they can make a move legally against what they consider to be a crime, right? The governments are authoritarian, and they will just go and they will arrest people whether there's a law or not, right? And that is part of sort of the culture of the country is sort of accepted under the guise that they are doing what's best for the public good, right? So Southeast Asia is quite risky at the moment. The governments are against you, and the governments don't necessarily need legislation in order to take very drastic measures. Surrogacy costs in India, in Southeast Asia, they've actually been going up. There is about 50,000 now because the cost of finding a surrogate goes up because of the risks that she takes, and of course legal expenses are going up as well, and immigration assistance is becoming more and more expensive because it's becoming more and more complicated. Now, I should say that Southeast Asia is very risky, and I advise everybody against going to Southeast Asia, but there's an exception, which is Chinese couples, and although the law is still against surrogacy in Thailand, for example, and it will be against surrogacy in Cambodia, a lot of Chinese couples are finding that the culture there is more accepting to them, and there are agencies that are creating sort of specific sort of back channel bureaucratic processes to support Chinese couples, and the Chinese government generally has a better relationship in Southeast Asia with the governments than the Western governments do. So there is still sort of a thriving surrogacy business for Chinese couples in that region. The problem is that the agencies that are working there will, as soon as a Chinese couple come to them, they will slap $15,000 to $20,000 on top of their normal fees, just because they know that this is a very desirable destination for Chinese couples, and Chinese couples generally have the money to pay. So if you're starting out at a price of $50,000 and you're adding $15,000 to $20,000 onto that just because you're Chinese, it begins to make better sense to go a more legal route and a more safe route and just go to the United States, where the costs are going to be about $75,000. Surrogacy in Kenya, the next slide is, Kenya is an up and coming destination. And it's typically up and coming because there are a couple of doctors who had businesses, who had clinics in India, who relocated to Kenya, a few years ago. And now that Southeast Asia is closing, and a lot of parents are wondering where they can go, where's sort of the next step. Kenya is really the spot. It's a fertility, it's a medical tourism sort of hub in Africa, but it's still far below sort of the level of medical care that we would expect, in Europe or in North America, right? So when we look at Kenya, we look at it through skeptical eyes. And I have to say that I have some clients who are actually on their way to Kenya now, because they had no other option. When Cambodia closed, they were absolutely stuck. They were basically trapped and had nowhere to turn, and Kenya was available to sort of take forward their programs. But in general, Kenya is sort of a last ditch destination. The programs are inexpensive. There are surrogate mothers available in Nairobi, and they seem relatively qualified. And on paper, the country looks pretty good. There is a cultural attitude in favor of assisted reproduction and surrogacy. In the constitution of the country, it's actually stated that every couple or every individual is inherently has the inherent right to a family. So creating a family through assisted reproduction is culturally accepted. But the problem is that in Kenya, the culture is vehemently anti-gay. And I know that about 50% of couples looking to create children through surrogacy arrangements now are gay married couples who are looking to start families. And it would be a mistaken judgment to go to Kenya if you were a gay couple. Not only is the risk that you would be deported if it were found out that you were gay as a gay foreigner, but if the surrogate found out that you were gay, it's very likely that she would not want to give the baby to you. And under Kenyan law, because there's no legislation, she has that right? She is the legal mother, and she can decide at the end of the process if she wants to give the baby to the intended parents or not. Prices in Kenya, the cost of surrogacy in Kenya, the next slide is around 43,000. This is what we saw in Southeast Asia before the crackdown happened and prices started rising. The next slide is altruistic surrogacy options. We've talked a little bit about this, right? I talked a little bit about the restrictions in altruistic surrogacy. Destinations for these types of programs include Canada, the United Kingdom, Greece. Czech Republic does altruistic surrogacy. There's a number of countries sort of in the various corners of the world where altruistic surrogacy has been legalized. But again, the problem with altruistic programs is that the IPs need to do a lot of legwork, and there's long wait times in order to find a surrogate, because typically there is a shortage of surrogates. They're not paid particularly well, and there's no professional service that goes out and actively recruits them and manages them, right? So there's not really a supportive infrastructure to find and match IPs with surrogates. The costs are still high. Even people think, well, as Canada is going to be inexpensive, but typically the costs are still around $65,000 to $80,000 US in Canada, which is not that much lower than a program in the United States. And a lot of people think, and I get this question all the time, people have the misconception that because altruistic surrogacy is legal, that means that the surrogacy contract will be binding. And at the end of the program, the surrogate mother has to hand the baby over to the intended parents. And the answer is no, that's not true. Under the laws in Canada, under the laws in the United Kingdom, the surrogate is the legal mother at the time of the birth, and it's true, and she remains that until there's a court order that changes the parental status from the surrogate to the intended parents. But when the baby is born, the surrogate mother retains all of the legal rights regarding the child and the future of the child, right? Which is not to say that your surrogate's going to run off with your baby. If you have a surrogacy program in Canada, typically it happens very rarely, and there's a lot of incentives for surrogates to obey sort of the terms of their agreement. But what you have to realize is that when you have a program in a country that does altruistic surrogacy, there's a follow-up legal process that needs to happen that many people just they're not aware of, right? When the baby is born, that's not the end of it. If you go to Canada, when the baby is born, then there's a legal process. You have to go through an adoption process. The surrogate has to give testimony, written affidavits, and you need to get a court order. So altruistic options, all the costs without all of the benefits. So, I'm pretty sure I've gone long. So I'm going to make a plug for the consultancy website. We have put together sort of an archive of information, very practical information for people who are considering the prospects of surrogacy. And you can find that at what we call the Sensible Surrogacy Guide, and you can go to the website sensiblesurrogacy.com and it's type in a keyword and you'll get a wealth of information. And we try and write articles in a very sort of practical. This is how you have to. These are the steps that you need to do in order to do your surrogacy program and be successful. So if you have questions, that is a good online resource. And if you go to the Surrogacy Guide and you can't find an answer, you can always write me or send an email to the consultancy, because like I said, we work with a lot of clients. We work typically for without charge, and you can reach me at bill@sensiblesurrogacy.com or fill out the form on the website.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot of information in your presentation, and I mean, what it seems to me is that the legal framework, the healthcare infrastructure, and as well the cultural attitudes you mentioned, they vary so greatly in each country. So what do you advise usually to intended parents? Where do you start? I mean, there's a lot of information, can be very overwhelming, and the situation in each country seems to change so frequently as well. So what's your advice on that?
Well, my first advice is always to give preference to a country where there is a solid legal framework in place. Whether you want to do an altruistic or commercial surrogacy program, if you go to a country where there is no legal framework, then you're basically in open territory. There's no guarantee what's going to happen. You don't know what the law is going to be tomorrow. You don't really have any rights in terms, of the future of your family if the laws do change. And the big horror stories, that we've seen in the media have all been in countries where there was no legislation. There was no legislation actually in India, and India changed its laws. There was no legislation in Thailand, and then Thailand cracked down. There was no legislation really at the federal level. There was no legislation, in Mexico. There was no legislation in Cambodia. And this is where people get stuck. They get stuck because they go into this sort of landscape, this legal landscape, where it's completely uncertain. They start what is basically a legal process, which is a surrogacy contract, and then they hope that the laws are not going to change underneath their feet. Mm-hmm. And that's the first mistake, right? You want to go someplace where there's a strong legal framework that supports you, because I don't think there's really been anybody, from a legal perspective, who's had serious problems in any country where the surrogacy has been legislated. There are some issues for couples who live in countries where surrogacy is prohibited. For instance, if you live in Italy, if you live in France, then you need to sort of step a little bit deeper, right? It's not just a question of where can I go legally to have the surrogacy procedure, but then you have to consider the question of where can I go where when the baby is born, I can bring him legally into the country. I can legally bring him home. Obviously to travel internationally, the baby is going to need a passport, which means citizenship. And if if you're Italian, for example, the Italian government really disapproves of surrogacy, and it's unlikely that the Italian embassy overseas is going to grant citizenship to a baby born through surrogacy. So you can't really depend on the Italians, right, on your own embassy. You have to go to a country where the baby is going to be able to get a passport through some other way. And that was actually a big draw in Thailand or in Cambodia, because the baby could get a Cambodian or a Thai passport after it's born. In the United States, the baby is eligible for U.S. citizenship and U.S. passport, which means that as soon as the baby's born, the baby can go and travel to Europe without too much trouble. So, again, it's a question of what is the legal framework. It's not just a legal framework of where I can do this, but when I do this, is there a legal framework for returning home safely with my baby? And that's the first question that really needs to be asked.
Yeah, I assume once the baby is born, there's still a lot to consider and to think of to make sure you can get home safely with the baby. Yeah.
When the baby's born, that's really the beginning of the second part of the journey that is often overlooked.
Yeah, and I guess it varies also very much per country how long you might have to stay in the country of choice once the baby has been born, as you mentioned, visa, passports, all those things.
Exactly. I have two children who were born in India, and one was American, by birth. One was Spanish because my partner is Spanish. And the American baby had no problems getting a U.S. citizenship and passport and sailed through, and it was very easy to deal with. The Spanish, however, were very difficult because Spanish law was not supportive, and to working with the Spanish consul, they had a lot of requirements to make sure that the woman was not selling her baby, right? The woman was not being forced to give up her baby. Because surrogacy, there's no legal framework for surrogacy in Spain. The consul general basically had to make up his own program and his own requirements to satisfy his belief that the surrogacy program was upright. And the truth is that the way that he did it changed completely after his replacement came in, right? So even from embassy to embassy of the same country, the rules change dramatically, and even over time within the same embassy, the rules change dramatically. So you really have to, when you start the process, talk to your embassy and find out how supportive they're going to be.
Exactly. Good advice. Great. Bill, I put your contact details on the screen. So if anyone has any further questions or would like to contact Bill directly, you can do so through the email address on the screen. Saying that, I think we've come to the end of our webinar. A big thank you to Bill for your contribution today, and everyone who joined our webinar today. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Thank you.